All right. Thanks everybody coming today for me to talk a little bit about simplifying open source license compliance. This talk is not going to go into detail a lot about specific open source licenses. It's really kind of like a summary of the conversation I typically have when people ask me about how to open source a project. And I'm going to try and do it at a fairly high level that doesn't go into details about different kinds of licenses, because for most people in most situations, the licenses don't really matter that much for the kind of compliance work you need to do to open source a project. The agenda, it's only a half an hour talk. So we're going to go over a couple of things first. So give an introduction, because you have to do that, especially when you're a lawyer. I have to remind you that I'm not your lawyer. Talk a little bit about the goals. I'm going to talk a little bit about what my goals are, because I really am trying to do a talk that's a little different than I think most lawyers give when they're at conferences, and what most free software lawyers, open source lawyers talk about when they give conferences. Talk a little bit about how you actually start a project in practice, and the decisions that usually people come to me, or they talk to an experienced engineer when they're starting an open source project. Some of the things you have to think about when you're maintaining your project going forward. And if we have time, get to some of the things that I don't think most people generally need to worry about, at least initially. Introduction. So I am a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. I think all the talks in this room today have been from lawyers. So you've probably heard that a lot, but of course, this is not legal advice. I'm talking in general terms. A little bit about me. I'm general counsel at Civic Actions. Civic Actions is a professional service firm. We do design and technology consulting, mostly for government agencies, but also for nonprofits. We use a lot of free and open source software in our work. Prior to becoming a lawyer, I worked for about 17 years at the state of Connecticut in various IT roles. I was an associate director for a while, and a systems engineer, and security and identity access management. I do know how to program. I don't know if it really matters to me anymore for this presentation, but I've been saying it for a long time. If anyone in the audience is using software that I wrote, you probably should stop using it. I was never particularly good at it. That's part of the reason why I went to law school, but it has helped me in my legal career, because it makes it a little bit easier when I'm talking about software development. And it really does matter how software gets engineered when you're talking about open source licensing compliance. I did start my legal career talking about open source software, free software. I started at the Software Freedom Law Center. And for the last 9 years, I've been primarily advising open source and free culture organizations on open source licenses and related free culture licenses, including as part of my role at General Counsel at Civic Actions. So what are the goals for this talk? So I'm going to talk about how you open source a project where you're making a good faith effort to open source software. So I'm not going to talk about like the minimum you have to do. I am not going to talk about how you can maximize your profit revenue. I'm not going to try and convince you that you should open source your software. I'm going to go with the assumption that the people coming to this talk just kind of want to know what's normal, like what people who are open sourcing projects typically do, on the assumption that they want to be like an active, good contributor in the community. And they're not trying to push the envelope in any way, but they're just kind of doing the normal thing when they already understand the value of open source. They use it, they want to contribute back, and they know the project that they want to open source. I'm also going to focus on the popular licenses that OSI has published on their webpage. The reason why I do that is because they still are the most common licenses that are out there. And it's probably what most people should be talking about. And it makes it a little bit easier to talk about things if you don't have to worry about every little squirrely case, because there are definitely some licenses that have some odd corners to them. But if you focus on the popular licenses, you can really start to make some generalizations. So what I'm going to talk about is the most common scenario for starting an open source software in my experience. I've seen this happen at private companies. I've seen this happen at nonprofits. I've seen this happen at universities. And this is definitely, in my experience, what community projects, so hobbyist projects, or however you want to characterize it. I think hobbyist is probably not the right characterizations, because some of these community projects are quite huge and sophisticated, and they seem like more than hobbies to me. But it's pretty common. This is how projects start. I'm going to try and keep it simple and straightforward, because starting an open source project really doesn't need to be that hard. And I am going to try and speak with lawyers in mind, but it should be accessible to everyone. Not going to talk a lot about the licenses, but I am going to try and speak in terms that lawyers can understand. So there might be a couple things. If you're a technologist on this call, you're wondering like, why is he explaining Git in such simplified terms? It's because not everyone's an engineer, not everyone's a software developer. And if you're a lawyer, sometimes the most intimidating thing out there is that you have trouble keeping up with the jargon, the technology jargon that the people you're talking to are talking about. I am going to mention GitHub and GitLab because the reality is that's where a lot of open source software development is taking place today. It's not endorsements of those platforms. If I criticize or say anything that's critical of them, it's also not, that's not really my goal either. I'm just trying to kind of describe what happens in practice in the real world today from my observations. Um, and GitHub and GitLab are pretty popular. There are other options out there as well. So what aren't my goals? I'm not going to talk about everything that open source license allows you to do, what you can't do. I'm not going to talk the specifics of any licenses. I'm not going to, I mentioned, I'm not going to try to convince you that you should do it. I assume that you want to. I'm going to try and stay away from like any of the controversial things that come up when free software lawyers talk. So I'm going to try not to get into any of the gray areas or say anything that some lawyer who might be watching this talk is going to say, I don't like that you're telling people that. I vehemently disagree. It should be pretty non-controversial, everything I'm saying. It should be just kind of normal. I'm not going to teach you how to distribute software, and I'm not going to talk about what you need to do if you're distributing compiled software like apps for a phone and what you need to do. Really, the reason why I'm doing this talk is I'm trying to make it simple for people to do it, because in my experience, very often the conversations get sidetracked into these weird rabbit holes where people start asking like really detailed questions about subsections of a particular license, when really all you should be doing is just getting on with open sourcing your project, and that you don't need to worry about those corner cases a lot. And talking about how that scenario might play out is a barrier to actually accomplishing work. So just focusing on the normal, what most people do, like what you actually need to think about and where people are putting their effort there, I think is helpful. Particularly for lawyers who might be new to this space of like, this is what normally happens. And if you're going beyond this and you don't have a particular reason to be going beyond this, you might kind of want to like reset and think about like, do you really need to be going down that rabbit hole? Like, why are you in that situation? So starting a project. So I'm going to divide this into two parts: starting the project and maintaining the project. So in starting a project, a couple of things you really have to think about is, where are you going to publish the code? What the license is going to be, what you're going to name your project, and you also need to question whether or not you're going to own the code as well. So where are you going to publish it? The most popular approach is to use GitHub or GitLab. That's just particularly where I am now. Our major customer is the US government and state governments. Anytime our customers ask about where are they going to put their open source project, they already have a GitHub repository. That's just the reality of it. For non-technologists out there, GitHub and GitLab are both are based on an open source software platform called Git, distributed version control. The purpose of distributed version control is really to make it easy for people to make forks and to make modifications to those forks and then bring them back together. So if you're a lawyer, you have redlined a document before. I have a contract, I send it to you. I already have track changes turned on. You make your redline changes, you send it back to me. I review your changes, and I may or may not accept those changes. And then we go back and forth until we come to an agreement. You usually have somebody who owns that draft, and they're in control of it. They can't reach out and change all the documents on my computer. For the most part, we're being very careful about, what copies have we changed, what were changed in the copies that we exchanged, and who's controlling the master copy. That's the job of distributed version control. That's why that's why technologists use GitHub, is they're trying to coordinate lots of changes to many, many files. It's not just one Word document that might be 5 pages long or 200 pages long, but they're worried about, thousands of individual documents that could be anywhere from 5 lines long to, hundreds of lines long that they're trying to coordinate. And it's important to recognize that when you put things on GitHub, you're not actually giving up control. You're just sharing the copies you have and making it easy for people to get copies themselves, make changes to their own copies, and then provide suggestions back. I bring this up because it's a pretty common concern for people who are new to open source software. And for some people in this call might think like this is simplified, but they're worried of like, oh, open source means anyone can change it. I can't let anyone change my software. What if they break it, or what if they put a security flaw, or what if they put a backdoor in it? I don't want them to change to make it so that they can log into my computer. I'm like, well, that's not really what happens. Like, this is about exchanging drafts and changes, right? So but if you're going to open source your software, you want to get it out there so other people can see it. But you're still going to retain control about who can make those changes. You're also going to name the repository. So if you're going through the little wizard on GitLab or GitHub, they're going to ask you for a name for it. For lawyers, this is important because if you're thinking it through and you're like, trademarks, well, there's actually two reasons why you have to think about the name of the repository. One is trademark infringement. Sure, you want to think about that. Don't pick a name for your repository or your project name that is going to infringe on a trademark. Pretty commonly, I'm going to say it's pretty commonly, it is not unusual for people to name projects after popular open source projects that they're familiar with. So it's not unusual for someone to name their project and use the words like Apache or Debian or GNU or Linux. Those are well-known trademarks in the open source world. You shouldn't name your project after those unless you're actually associated with those projects and you're following their rules around them. So just avoid any confusion around that. Avoid any well-known trademarks when you're picking the name. Probably the more important thing from a practical point of view, and developers are usually pretty good at this, is pick a relatively unique name. If you make software and you call it blog, there's going to be other software out there that's called blog. And one of the realities about modern software development is that there's fairly complicated, organic, decentralized ways of distributing software. And at some point in time, if you want to fit into that ecosystem, you're going to have a unique name. So a lot of times when people are picking names, they're really kind of looking at like, well, what's the URL of the software package where the code is being hosted? Or can you do something like incorporate your company name, which is pretty unique? So if Civic Actions were going to make blogging software, we might call it like the Civic Actions Super Awesome Blog or something like that. Might be a little bit long. Maybe we abbreviate it to like Civic Actions A blog or something. But at least the package name is going to be kind of unique there, and not worried about trademark infringements, and you're also getting a unique name. You can change these things later, but these names tend to kind of get incorporated into the software packages and in library names, and they carry through, and it can be kind of a pain to change it later when you decide to publish that app in an app store, or if it's a library that you're developing and people want to incorporate it into their other contracts, and now there's naming conflicts because you pick something just a little bit too generic, or it conflicts with an existing package they're already using. So publish it publicly available from day one. So I already talked about using GitHub and GitLab. I want to talk about this specifically, though, is making it publicly available. In practice, a lot of the value around open source licensing comes from the fact that other people can use it. Applying an open source license to software package that you're not going to share to other people doesn't really make sense. Like, you're not licensing it to yourself, you're licensing it so other people know they have permission to use it. If they can't access it, they're not going to be able to use it. So you're not really open sourcing anything. I could have a very long conversation, and and trying to convince people of like, this is why you should make it publicly available, and are any of them going to really use it? What's the best package to open source? But the reality is, if you've bought into the idea of you should open source it, and you've got this sense that the community or there's value around open sourcing it, one of the major things that makes open source useful to the world and has had such a huge impact on not just the technology field, but the world and culture generally, is that open source software is shared publicly, that other people can get it, that you don't need to ask permission to use someone's software. You don't need to ask permission to get a copy of it, that you can find it by doing a web search. that it's integrated into these fairly complicated distribution chains for libraries, that it's already there, that you don't need to talk to the developer that made it. So making it publicly available is kind of key from a practical point of view of making it open source. If you don't want to make it publicly available, and I guess there are reasons why people have reservations on it, like just understand that you're not really open sourcing it. There are some benefits to it too, besides like the benefits that come generally from open sourcing it, but like it does promote good coding practices. When you start a repository from day one that's publicly available, the developers who are working on it recognize that it's publicly available and they're careful about what they put it in there. And the reality of software development is you don't want your software to be super specific to you. You want your software to be general, and reusable. That's part of the power of software. So if you make it available from day one, you're not going to end up with that super specific stuff about your organization. It's just not going to show up there. They're going to keep the configuration information somewhere else and save the work. And it's just never going to get easier to make it available if you don't do it on day one. Inner sourcing is not open sourcing. That's just doing it inside of your company. I have a long story about this, but like the reality is that at most companies, like they'll probably have an easier time if you open source it than if you inner source it, because they're going to Google for it. And if they can find it on GitHub, they'll probably use it, but it's a lot less likely that they're going to figure out how to find it on your own inner source thing. And again, just final point, like the whole point of the open source licenses is to give access to third parties. So the other thing that you're going to need to figure out, and if you're going through the wizard on GitLab or GitHub or some other platform, they're going to ask you, because they're going to want you to help you do this, is what's your license going to be? So OSI's popular licenses, I've got them listed here. If you don't know a lot about licenses and you're not looking at one of these licenses, you're probably overthinking it, and you should really come back to one of these licenses. These are called the popular licenses for a reason. It is what most lawyers who work in the space are familiar with. It's what most engineers who are educated around free software licenses are going to look at. And if, push came to shove and you wanted me to make this list shorter, it's pretty easy to make this list shorter. There's a few common permissive licenses that are out there, and there's really only one copyleft license that I think is, from my point of view, reasonable to choose if you're going to choose copyleft. And I think that's reflected in the community by the fact that most other copyleft licenses have somehow accommodated the GPL. There are other licenses out there. I'm not knocking other licenses. There's reason to use other licenses. But if you're new to open source and you're trying to keep it simple, these are the licenses you should really be considering unless you've got a specific reason not to. Of course, I'm at an open source conference for the open source initiative. You don't need to write a license. You just don't. The reason you have is probably not a good reason. It's probably been talked about dozens, if not hundreds of times. Writing your own license is actually going to make it harder for you. These licenses cover most scenarios. You probably aren't a special case, but if you're thinking you're a special case already, I assume you won't listen to me because you're firmly convinced you're a special case, so that's fine. So I'm going to move past it. But if you write your own license, most people are going to look at you and probably try to figure out how to get out of the conversation and try not to explain you don't do it. Just use one of these licenses. So how do you choose a license, right? Because I've narrowed down the list there. When I talk to people about it, I have my own permissions. I have my own favorites and try to do this without bias. But the three things that I usually tell people to focus on when they're choosing a license is, do you want a copyleft license or a permissive license? Broadly, the theories behind this are, and you can argue over beers for hours if you want, copyleft licenses are designed to encourage people who use your software to also produce and give back to the software commons. And they're going to make it a little bit harder for people to build proprietary software off it or proprietary businesses off of it. It's not foolproof. There's different tactics that people evolve, but basically copyleft is meant to encourage sharing and giving back more. And permissive licenses really are about kind of maximizing the number of people who are going to use it with more minimal obligations. Although I would say, like, the most common reason why people get sued for using free culture licenses, and it does happen occasionally, is the lack of attribution. And that's a common feature for copyleft and permissive. So you're probably not any more likely to get sued or not get sued if you're using copyleft or not. But those are the two major theories behind it. Most people in this space end up picking a favorite, and they'll have their reasons for doing it. You have to look at your own business reasons and your values for that. So know what your preference is around that. But if you're going to upstream, if you're talking about making modifications or a module that's going to fit into an existing open source project, or even if you're going to participate in an ecosystem, look at that ecosystem. Look at the project that you're trying to get your code changes involved in, or that you're writing a module for. You probably want to use that license. If you're a big copyleft person and you're working on something that's meant to work with an Apache whatever, you probably should just use the Apache license, because people in that community are going to expect it. And if you're using the same license as that community, especially if it's the Sode King code base, like, you might basically be required to use the same license as them, or you might as well, because not using the same license is really just causing problems for you and other people. And you don't want to get distracted from actually doing productive work because you're spending your time talking about the nicenesses of license compatibility. Really, what you could have been is just be a good community member and recognize that you're joining an existing community and align with those values. If you're not okay with aligning with those values and those practices, consider if you actually are in the right community and you want to contribute there. And similarly, if you're contributing to a copyleft license project, just align with that community as well. Like, it's not really worth the fight, and you're probably going to lose, because most people don't change their licensing practices because some new third party asks them to. If you're starting from scratch, consider the third-party libraries that you're going to use. Your developers will often know, even before they start writing code, if there's any critical library they have to use. If one of those libraries is licensed underneath a copyleft license, you might have your answer about what you should use. Is you're going to use something that's licensed underneath GPL. It's essential for the project. There you go. You might as well make it GPL, right? At my company, we make big uses of Drupal. A lot of our projects are based on it. We maintain modules that use Drupal. Drupal is licensed under GPL v2 or later. Guess what we license those modules under? We license it underneath GPL v2 or later. It is not an option not to use Drupal. We're going to use it. So that answers the choice. It happens that a lot of engineers at my company really do prefer copyleft, but it doesn't really matter. Like, we're in the Drupal community. We're using Drupal as a third-party library. Like, we use GPL v2 or later. If we make contributions around an Apache project, then we're going to probably be using the Apache license around that. Again, don't write your own license. You don't need to. It doesn't matter how good of a lawyer you are. Like, really, when you're thinking about open source license compliance, speaking to lawyers, this is not transactional work. This is compliance work. Think this is about complying with a regulation. You don't really have the opportunity to negotiate the licensing terms with the upstream maintainers of the project. What you're really doing is choosing what regulations you want to comply with. So you can engineer your project to choose the license you're dealing with, but at the end of the day, people are not going to change the licensing terms to fit your particular business needs. They really don't have the motivation, because you're often not paying them. And even if they do, it's often such a complicated engineering task that they have obligations to other people. It's just not practical. Speaking a little bit about patent licenses, I know I'm also running out of time here, is like, if you have software patents, hire a patent attorney who's familiar with to do with it. If you don't have patents that read on software, like, probably don't worry about it, because you're creating problems for yourself. Most people don't have software patents. Things that you want to look at: your license file. You should have a copy of the license in your project. It should just be a copy of the license you just chose. GitHub makes it really easy to do it. You'll comply with almost every license out there because they require you to distribute a copy of the license when you're doing that. README file. This is also a really important thing. The README file is pretty simple. Describe your project. Describe how to use the project. Describe how to contribute to the project. Include a licensing statement. That licensing statement is typically going to point back to that licensing file I just mentioned. Here's a couple examples. This is the one I often use. This is the one recommended by the Apache license. You don't have to use it if you're using the Apache license. Here's the one from GPL. I'm not giving you time to read it. It doesn't really matter. It just says, here's the license. Include a copyright statement. You should do it. It doesn't really matter if you do it or not, I suppose, for some people, but like, good practice would be you should do it. Maintaining the project. Two main events that you really need to think about: when you add third-party code and when you get code contributions. When you're adding third-party code, check to make sure the license is compatible with your project. We're really talking about GPL compatibility here. There's two main resources on the internet: the Fedora project and the Free Software Foundation maintain listed license and whether or not they're GPL compatible. If you have a GPL licensed project, make sure all your licenses are GPL compatible. If you have a permissively licensed project, make sure none of your libraries are licensed underneath the GPL, because you might just change the license for your project. Update the license file when you add more licenses. You add a copy of the license of the library that you're adding to it. Just keep a running list. It's super boring. And don't delete anything from your third-party code. Any licenses, copyright notices, attribution notices, just don't remove them. You don't need to add them if they're missing, but you can't delete them. That's just a requirement of most licenses out there. It keeps it pretty simple. So just don't. Just whatever they did. If there's no copyright notice, don't add a copyright notice. You could get it wrong. You don't have to add it. If there's a license file there, just keep the license file there. That's the license there. You don't really have to look at it. But make sure that you're paying attention to compatibility of your own project. So code contributions. Free software lawyers talk about this all the time. Contributor license agreements, inbound, outbound, developer certificate of origin. If you're starting out, there's a pretty well accepted convention of inbound equals outbound. Personally, I think people should be more explicit about it. And what you should probably do is, in your contributor instructions, just tell them, by contributing to this project, you agree your contributions are underneath the license of this project. Adopt that inbound, outbound policy explicitly. I just tell people to put that in that README file that I mentioned before. It's nice and easy. It's what the community expects. And actually, if you're using GitHub and you do nothing, their terms of service adopt this policy for you by default, which is kind of nice. So if you're on GitHub and you never signed a contributor license agreement and you're wondering, hey, I didn't tell you what my license is, you actually did. You did it when you signed up for your GitHub account. They adopt the inbound, outbound policy by default. Pretty much all that's pretty much all you really need to do around that issue. So that's pretty much what you really need to do to start most open source projects. I think it's relatively simple. I hit my time box on that, which I'm pretty happy about. Don't really have time to talk about the things that you don't need to do, but I think I might have time for maybe one or two questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Do we have any questions from the audience? We have a couple minutes here. So Mike Wu asks, Mark, do you have any good links to resources that succinctly explain why you shouldn't write your own license? Let's just say that I'd like to send some links to someone I've been dealing with lately.
I don't know of any ones that do it succinctly. I think probably the most effective thing would be point them to the archives for the OSI licensing review list. I'm sure you can find a thread that will go vary back between angry, frustrated, and polite. It's a well accepted opinion, although that's probably a great blog post for OSI to write, is just here are the reasons why you don't want to do it. My short reason is we're trying to build a software commons. And if you come up with a new license, you stop the participation in the software commons, because everyone has to stop and think, is this open source? Can I use this commons? What are my new rules? And now you're taking yourself out of it. You're increasing the transaction costs. And that kind of defeats the point for practical purposes.
Thank you for that answer. I think we can sneak one more in. Well, if there are no further questions, I see a lot of thank yous and appreciations of that suggestion. So once
Thanks,
again,
folks. Appreciate your time. Bye.
All right, and this room has a break for 1 hour, and so enjoy yourselves. There are talks going on in some of the other rooms.